Hey guys, so I got this amazing email question from George asking me Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings, which book series is better. So if you are someone who watched the shows, the TV series, and you loved it, and now you wanna check out the books, this video is for you. And by the way, I'm not gonna tell you which, movie to watch. So like I'm not comparing the, movies by Peter Jackson with Game of Thrones TV series. I'm not doing that. Okay, I'm talking about the books. So I'm pretty sure if you haven't read either Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings, you're probably pretty intimidated by both. Like if you've seen Game of Thrones, and by the way, Game of Thrones is just the first volume. Okay, it's not the whole series. The name of the series is A Song of Ice and Fire, and Game of Thrones is just volume one. Okay, but the TV show, which is based on all the books, kind of mixed in together, is called Game of Thrones. Okay, so but I will call it Game of Thrones because that's probably how you're used to calling it. So, if you have seen one of the Game of Thrones books in a bookstore, it's really humongous. Like books are like this big. I mean, the size of your Bible, or your dictionary or something. It's really big, intimidating book. Okay, and Lord of the Rings, they're not as big, but they seem pretty intimidating too. Because I mean, there is three volumes, and each volume is like close to 500 pages. So let's compare them, and by the end of this video, I'll tell you which one you should start with. Okay. So first, just a little bit of history, just a little bit of background information on Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. So as you know, Lord of the Rings series was written by J.R.R. Tolkien. Okay, and he was a professor of English language and literature, and he was also teaching other subjects. Um, and he lived, close to sort of the early 20th century. So Lord of the Rings is definitely older. It was written, decades before Game of Thrones, and of course, sort of history, times change, and the questions, the sort of day-to-day things that Tolkien was dealing with were very different from the things that you know George R. Martin was dealing with. So Tolkien um, survived World War One. He was actually a soldier in World War One, and there is a really good movie called Tolkien, which came out in 2018. You can kind of watch it if you want to learn more about Tolkien's life without reading a lot. So he survived World War One and he survived World War Two. So Tolkien's worldview, it's much more kind of serious. You can say it's more existentialist. Uh, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings sort of asks questions like, does life have a meaning? It's and one thing that really matters in Tolkien's work is his distinction between good and evil. All right, so there are good guys and there are bad guys. Okay, of course, the good guys in Game of Thrones are, Lord of the Rings are Frodo, uh, Sam Baggins, Bilbo, Gandalf. These are the good guys in Lord of the Rings, and the bad guys are Saruman and Sauron, and these orcs. They're the bad guys. Okay, so there's kind of a clear distinction between good guys and bad guys, and of course, you know, uh, having seen war firsthand, always at the back of Tolkien's mind, those orcs and the bad guys, they were the opposing side in the war, which were the axes, the central powers in World War One. The Austro-Hungary and Germany. So there is a clear distinction between good guys and bad guys in Lord of the Rings, which you do not have with in Game of Thrones, right? So why is that? Well, I mean, first of all, it's just kind of personal choice. I mean, George R. Martin could have written sort of stories. I mean, it is to some extent personal choice, but it is also historical circumstances because George R. Martin began to write Game of Thrones around 1991, which is right when the Soviet Union collapsed, and you kind of no longer had sort of good guy and bad guy, and the bad guy kind of threatens. I mean, Soviet Union fell apart, and so pretty much America was the only significant player in world politics, and so you just don't have clear distinction between good and evil, and it's kind of blurry in Game of Thrones, and that's one of the things I really like about Game of Thrones is this kind of ambiguity, because it's brings a lot of unpredictability to the story. And let me ask you a question. I mean, are you more like a Lord of the Rings guy, or are you more like a Game of Thrones person? Like, I mean, are you a clearly good guy or clearly a bad guy? And I mean, guy, woman, or whatever your gender identification is. Um, well, probably, the answer is you're more like a Game of Thrones type of individual. You're kind of good, you're kind of bad. You're some, you're probably a decent human being, but you have hurt people. You've broken someone's heart. You've lied. You've perhaps cheated. So eh, kind of in our actual lives, okay, in our real human world. I mean, the distinction between good and evil, it's not this sharp line which it is in Lord of the Rings. It's more like Game of Thrones. Like, we are all kind of good and kind of evil. We are all kind of like Jon Snow or Arya or one of these characters. So this is kind of my first insight. If you want to sort of associate with a character, just kind of have a story to which you might relate, okay, to which you might um, relate to. Game of Thrones is more relevant to sort of, it's more realistic. Let's put it this way, okay. So that's realism, kind of you being able to associate with the character. Game of Thrones is the winner. Okay, now then I would like to look at sort of language, okay, because one of the reasons why you read is because because of the writer's style, and that is something you cannot perceive like from a movie. Like, it's just you might sort of see what happens in the story, the plot, but the language cannot be conveyed in the form of a movie. So as far as language is concerned, like as far as writing style, as far as sort of literature as such is concerned, Lord of the Rings is way above Game of Thrones. Okay, Tolkien was a professor. Very few people knew English language at the level that he knew it. Like, he didn't just know English. He didn't know which, how words originated, what's the history of, words. He also knew Old Saxon. He knew Finnish. He knew all these Scandinavian languages and dialects. And I mean, Tolkien was just a linguistic genius. And, as far as sort of language is concerned, you cannot compare Game of Thrones. Like, Game of Thrones doesn't even come close to Lord of the Rings as far as literature is concerned. All right. All right. Now, let's look at sort of story. Okay, how interesting the story is, the pace, the unpredictability, sort of, the story itself. Okay, now this one is pretty hard. Okay, it's kind of hard to compare. They're both pretty interesting stories, but I would say um, they're equal. Okay, they're pretty much equal, but Lord of the Rings is a little bit better. I mean, it's a shorter book. Game of Thrones sometimes it kind of it's a little bit slow. There is politics sometimes, but they're both really really interesting plots, really interesting stories. But I would say Lord of the Rings is a little bit better. Okay, with as far as storytelling is concerned, plot and stuff like that. But Game of Thrones is more unpredictable. However, story wise, Lord of the Rings is a better story. Okay, now let's look at difficulty. Okay, and this one is really important, because I mean, there are so many books which you wish you have read, but you just can't because they're hard. Mark Twain, said that a classic is a book which everyone wishes he has read, but doesn't actually want to read. That's what makes something a classic, a masterpiece. That it's hard. And as far as this criterion is concerned, Game of Thrones is better in this regard. It's much more readable. It's just much easier to read. You can read it quicker. You don't have to kind of reread some parts. With Lord of the Rings, it's a little bit heavyweight sometimes. You just kind of have to really really focus. Just kind of your attention should be undivided. So as far as kind of readability, Game of Thrones is better, right? So, like I said at the beginning of this video, I will tell you which one you should read. Okay, so kind of a lot of times I, kind of get frustrated, when I want some advice, and I have these two options, and people tell me, well, do what you like. What is your prayer? Like, I don't like it. Like, if you know your stuff, just tell me what to do. So that's what I'm gonna do for you guys. I will tell you, what to do. So here is my verdict. Okay, you go to your closest bookstore and buy Game of Thrones. All right, that's what you gotta start with. Okay, it's easier to read, and Volume One of Game of Thrones is an absolutely incredible read. It's addicting. It's hard to put it down, and I know a lot of you are intimidated by how big it is, because the size is humongous. It's like Volume One. It's like 800 pages, 850 pages, something like that. It's a big read, but it does, once you start reading it, pages fly by. Like, you're not gonna be like, oh man, my god, this is so hard, there are so many pages. Like, you'll get so into it. So just don't think about it. Go to your closest bookstore and start with Game of Thrones. Okay, buy it and start reading it today, and then see how it goes. And maybe you'll read Volume 2, Volume 3, Volume 4, Volume 5 and perhaps you won't like it as much after Volume 2, and if that's the case, then you can pick up Lord of the Rings. So that's my suggestion. Start with Game of Thrones. And when I read it for the first time, I thought I was just going to read Volume 1, but I liked it so much I read all 5 volumes of Game of Thrones. So that's my comparison.